Hey everybody, it's Durger time, and it is Christmas in July. Because Adam Ryland, the creator of Total Extreme Wrestling at Grey Dog Software, just dropped us with a surprise announcement. Total Extreme Wrestling 9. What's even better is it's set to drop not in a few months, not in a year, but just in a few weeks. With a public beta on July 27th and a final release just 1 week later on August 3rd. With just being a month away, Grey Dog Software has been releasing dev journals at a breakneck rate. According to Adam, they are planning to document over 200 changes and additions to the game from its predecessor. With all the changes coming down the pipeline, I thought it would be useful for all of you if I went ahead and documented, in my opinion, some of the most important game-changing and sometimes maybe even controversial changes from each previous week's developer entries. I'm going to only be covering some of the biggest changes for the sake of time, but know that each day has outlined multiple updates, tweaks, and changes. If you want to see the full list, I left a link in the description below. With all of that out of the way, let's get into it. Before the first day, we did get a quick Q&A from the developer over some of the most frequently asked about elements of the new game. First, why is it called TEW 9 and not TEW 2024? We all kind of expected the numerical increase to happen with the date range. They said it decided to change the name scheme entirely to try to denote that it's no longer an annual release. This makes sense, obviously from 2016 to 2020, now 2024, it seems like their development cycle from post-dev, like post-release, bug patches and improvements to actually developing the next games, taking them about now 4 years. So it does make sense. It's also noted that this is, I believe, the 20th anniversary of the TEW series, so I think them wanting to denote something different was kind of going through their minds as they were doing it. What will the licensing situation be? According to Grey Dog Software, they are moving from the E-license system of old to a QLM license system. I'm not familiar with this, but apparently they have been using it for the last couple years. When I bought TEW 2020, they were still using the E-license system, which is a kind of pain in the butt. It's not really the best, but it worked. It was really cumbersome if you were trying to jump between multiple machines or things like that. I don't know anything about this new license system, so let me know if you've experienced it. I guess if you bought TEW 2020 recently, last couple of years, you probably already used it. Let me know if it's maybe an improvement or it's not a big deal. I know a lot of people complain about that system. It's always felt a little archaic, especially compared to other like DRM strategies that exist out there. But hopefully this is an improvement, or at least that it's the status quo. Unfortunately for people, also, you will not be able to continue your TEW 2020 save games. It's a common question here, and unfortunately, because they are two different separate products, you won't be able to transfer them over. There is a converter, and they are saying that you can convert the database over to the new game. This is going to be pretty similar to how it was in TEW 2020. There is a database converter system, so presumably you can import the databases over. You would have to take your save game in TEW 2020, turn that save into a database, convert that database over to the new game. But that might not work that great. There's a lot of new features potentially, so probably chances are, unless you're committed to doing a lot of back-end work to get your save to work perfectly with the new systems, chances are you're probably going to lose your save games. And unfortunately for Mac users, this game still is Windows only. Not surprising if you've followed their sort of development processes of what kind of games they make and what they use to make those games. So it's unfortunate, but you'll still have to emulate. And luckily, because it is basically running on the same game engine, if your system can handle 2020, chances are you're going to be a-okay with this new game. Now, with that all said, let's go ahead and get into the meat of each day. Now, I'm going to highlight just sort of the specific items that I think are noteworthy within these days, and some of these are a doozy and potentially huge game changers, but know that there are plenty of other updates. Each day has had maybe about anywhere between 4 to 8 updates that are various, quality of life improvements to some really big changes. I'm going to try to highlight all the big changes for you that are going to probably drastically change the way you experience the game. But if you want to see that full list, again, there is a link in the description for you. Now, day one started out with probably one of the biggest changes in the game that's been released so far, and it's the booking team creative energy and ideas system. So an entirely new system that I think is hinting at the general tone of the updates within the new game and sort of the direction that the game is heading in, that you're either going to love or you might not like it as much, depending on what type of player you are. For me personally, this is everything I crave in these type of games, but if you're not the type of player that I am, you might end up finding this a little bit tedious or standoffish. So the booking team creative energy and idea system. According to Adam, each company can now optionally have a booking team of up to 5 people. The team is there to assist the head booker in carrying out their duties. At the start of each night of a show, the booking team meets, even if it's just a head booker working alone. Each member is rated on their booking skill and generates a new concept in the game called creative energy, or CE. The higher the skill level and better the teamwork of the team, the greater the levels of CE they will be able to generate. Some CE is automatically spent on the show to fulfill some basic creativity requirements of putting on a wrestling event. For example, the longer the show is, the more CE is required, with a penalty incurred for your final show rating if you don't have enough. Whatever CE is left over is banked, and you can either be saved to be used on future shows or spent on creative ideas, which will be covered in a second. So this is very similar if you play a lot of grand strategy games, paradox games. It's just almost like a mana system. Basically, you're using your talent to acquire a resource, and then using that resource to spend on performing specific actions in the game. Now, this is not every action. This is just sort of both a baseline requirement to run a proper show. So, the bigger the show, probably the more production you have, the larger, the longer it is, the more CE is going to be needed. And then also for special sort of actions that you're going to get that we're going to highlight in a second, you're going to be able to cash in that CE to perform them. So very cool, very different. And again, it seems like we're kind of delving into more of the backstage element so far with this sort of update. And that's kind of interesting because it's an area that I felt like was always kind of a little underdeveloped, and an area that could really differentiate TEW from some of its competitors that popped up that have been more of like a fantasy book sort of sandbox. This just seems like we're starting to lean more into a simulation aspect of simulating the entire show and trying to become sort of a spinning plate situation where you're trying to kind of deal with a bunch of things at once. To me, that's what I go for. I love that stuff. He continues to say that the booking team is like a high-pressure environment that will act as a hothouse. That is, relationships will tend to act as if they are on steroids, with people who would normally be mildly friendly really bonding, and people who would normally be slightly antagonistic becoming enemies. This means that while you can stuff your booking team with a lot of members in order to try to generate more CE, you run the risk of creating more drama. Having a chaotic booking team full of people that are playing politics, particularly if splits develop, can really harm how well it functions. Additionally, people will always take quite a morale hit if you kick them off the team, so you have to be careful about who you select. Keeping a close eye on the personalities involved and the existing relationships is key. Smaller teams have a disadvantage that they don't have as many people contributing, but they will be slightly easier to manage and get bonuses, particularly for someone working alone, to simulate greater levels of focus. Overall, finding a balance, adjusting a booking team can have a great boon for a company, whereas a dysfunctional one can cause a lot of issues. So, they're talking about this kind of becomes a game within a game, within TEW, where you're kind of trying to balance the personalities of the characters. And this makes sense if you see the development process of TEW 2020 that I felt like never was fully realized, which is the idea that you're you're kind of dealing with these personalities and attributes. So these characters are supposed to have personalities with them, and you're kind of trying to manage that locker room. It never felt fully like fleshed out for me in 2020, and it seems like if this was one of the first things that they decided to send out for us, I think it's kind of a tone that this is an area that they wanted to deeply develop for us. So in addition to the creative idea and the creative energy, the creative ideas element of this new process is essentially booking aids that you can deploy to give certain effects. So the available choices are creative finishes, angle ideas, gimmick ideas, storyline ideas, and character ideas. Each costs a certain amount of CE and can be used in-game. So the example they give here is that you might deploy a creative finish via a road agent note to a big match to try to boost its ratings a little bit more, or use a gimmick idea to increase the chance of someone's new gimmick being more successful. Each idea comes with a success rating that tells you how much of a gamble it is. So it's not, you might not always have a guaranteed success if you use it. If the gamble doesn't pay off, you may actually experience a penalty from using it, and then an expiry date for when you have until to use it. You can also have a random restriction applied to it, such as only being able to use for a specific worker or a specific situation. When you purchase an idea, you can name it so it's easy to keep track of and what you have available to you at any time. So I'm not sure what that looks like, but how I read that is this almost like little special power-ups, and it won't be like some people in the forums and on Reddit have been kind of talking about it might be like I think they fear that it's like, oh, if I want to have like a run-in finish, it's gonna have, I can only get it by like paying the CE for it. But I think what these are more generic, sort of like upgraded, like it'll just say creative finish, and then what that is up to you, but it's going to give you a bonus if you use it as long as it's successful. So maybe it is a run-in, or maybe it's something just unique happening. I think it's more of a mechanical thing than a specific finish. The same thing with the angles and creative ideas. I think it's a bonus you receive that you can kind of cash in and roll the dice on. It's interesting. Not sure how it plays out and how it will work. Ultimately, though, we'll have to see, but I think it's a good step in the right direction for, again, trying to kind of simulate more goings on in the backstage, and also like it gives us choices and makes the game more active and versus passive, which I think is always a bonus. One of the other highlights here, they do mention that specific people can request or demand to join a team and get annoyed with their political rivals if they are on the team. So, if you have somebody that's on the team and they're not, and they're enemies, it's like a Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels situation, the other will demand to be on the team as well, and they'll get a penalty. So you can't just avoid it. You're going to have to deal with these personalities as they start to come up. And start to navigate sort of the landscape of the backstage politics. And that's cool. That's super cool. They do highlight here also that overall these features work together to simulate the backstage politics of wrestling, make the locker room environment more vibrant, and give some extra fun mini games to help you feel like you're actually sitting in the booking chair. So that's cool. I think that's super neat. Some other add-ons to that is that we do find out here that they have worker ideas. So not only do the booking team come up with these, but the workers individually, if they have a certain creative mind, like if they have a certain threshold, can also come up to you and pitch their own ideas that get added to your stored ideas. Presumably you still have to pay the creative energy for it, but most of the time it's usually restricted to that worker. But again, a kind of neat idea that you could have somebody that's maybe not on the booking team but can come up with like, hey boss, I got an idea for a new gimmick. And it's up to you to decide if you want to kind of roll with that. Again, I don't know specifically if it's going to, like, what kind of flavor text it's going to be with that. I suspect it's just going to be pretty generic. Like, again, if we were talking about the gimmick, my suspicion would be that they'll say, hey, I have a creative gimmick idea. And then it's up to you to be like, oh, well, Bryan Danielson came up to me and said he wants to be a pirate, and you could type in pirate, right? But what you get mechanically is that bonus for the special thing. So for the people that are worried about, like, I don't want to be locked in to these sort of like pre-generated ideas, I suspect that's not the case. We're going to jump to day 2 now, and this one has a lot. And again, if you were picking up the theme that I was picking up, about there's a lot of stuff going on with the back room of the companies and sort of dealing with the back of house. I think they doubled down on day 2. So if you don't like that, man, you're really gonna not like this day. But if you are like me and you're interested in stuff like that, I think there's some really promising items that we are seeing here. So day 2, the inner circle. Each company can now have an inner circle. This is a series of optional roles that you can hand out to people on the roster. The benefit of this, outside of effects specific to each role, is that they can improve your relationship with each person chosen, positively impact their morale, and build loyalty. However, like the booking team, removing some of them from a role will hurt their morale and can even lead to an ugly scene. And you also have to deal with the politics of people getting upset if they're not chosen, if someone they dislike gets a role, etc. So the roles that they have added to the game that you can provide your roster with is locker room leaders, which we already had in the game, but now is more of a role that you select. Chief enforcers, head of talent relations, morale officer, senior road agent, senior referee, head men's and head women's trainer, a travel organizer, and the stooge. So what are all these? They do break it down in here pretty succinctly. Locker room leaders are pretty self-explanatory. They act exactly like they did in the previous games. The only difference here really is that you get to choose them, and they can have a pro or con depending on who they are and what their current status is on the roster. Also, having 2 locker room leaders, which you can have up to 5 within any company, they can become bitter rivals. Having 2 locker room leaders who have become rivals can become really damaging to the locker room as well as the jockey for prominence. So if you put 2 locker room leaders up there and something happens that turns one into like a rival, let's say you're All Elite Wrestling and you got the Bucks and Jericho and CM Punk, and then something happens, you have a muffin incident. There's going to be tension now, and putting them all in that role is going to exacerbate that. That's super cool. Super happy with that. I think that's going to be a fun way to simulate that sort of backstage tension. Chief enforcers, so you can have up to 3, and they're the ones who impose discipline on the backstage area, which they'll have lowering a chance of fights breaking out or people turning up late, etc. The downside is that the power may get to their head and negatively impact their behavior over time. On top of that, you'll be more likely to fall out with those who misbehave. Good enforcers need to be tough and should be well respected. Head of talent relations acts as a buffer between you and the locker room. If the position is filled, they automatically handle all but the most major locker room incidents on your behalf, and any blowback goes to them, not you. The major downside is that if you hand over some of your autonomy, you obviously no longer get a choice to how those incidents are handled, and you may not end up with the outcomes that you would have chosen. So it's interesting because you're technically removing a part of the game, sort of giving away part of that to the AI, but in return, you're dealing with now the negative ramifications of that, which is, the head of talent might get into fights with people, it might go to their head, they might make wrong calls you didn't like. Again, it's simulating that process of it's not just you and your fiefdom, you now have people working under you, which I think is super cool. Morale officers, the morale officers in charge of keeping the backstage area happy. The benefit is that their own positive impact on the locker room is amplified. They lessen the penalties of anyone who feels isolated, and they increase the chance of positive effects happening. The downside is that if they become unhappy, they will have a much worse impact than usual and can spread quickly to other people. They may also clash with unhappy or negative people. So again, more roles. Senior road agent, similarly, is another role you can add that will essentially give morale boosts for being in power for themselves, and they will tend to develop positive relationships with the booking team. So, you want to put someone there that you want to have a relationship with your bookers. There's the connection there that they're going to have a positive relationship with. Downside is obviously the power can go to their head. Senior referee, similarly, is a position for a ref. Could be in charge of the referee corps, and they're responsible for making sure the ring crew is set up and everything is set on pre-show. Again, not really like a super impactful role, other than it can cause other referees to get jealous. Again, do you see the theme? We're trying to build tension in the locker room, make the backstage more interesting. This is one of those roles that's trying to kind of force that to happen. Headsmen's and head women's trainer is giving you a boost, essentially. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but it's also allowing you to take control over the mentor-protege roles. So people that are being trained are more likely to become, the people that are training are more likely to become mentors for people than otherwise. Travel organizer is responsible for arranging the travel and accommodation for workers who are not local. The benefit is that they get regular morale boost for being given that responsibility. The downside is that they may annoy other workers if they are irresponsible or they screw up. It's interesting to note that this role is only available for medium-sized companies or smaller, as the bigger companies have admin staff to handle this. So that's kind of interesting. That's the only one I've seen so far that is specific to smaller companies. And then, of course, we have the Stooge. It's a secret role, quote unquote. The Stooge is the booker's eyes and ears backstage. They benefit from being able to report on happenings that otherwise might be invisible to you as the booker, and they are able to develop a bond with the booker directly. The downside is they must be kept happy, and if their morale becomes low, their relationship with the booker may deteriorate, and they can start spreading hurtful rumors. There are no particular skills needed for this, so it's kind of an interesting little role. If you want to try to get the ins and outs of the locker room that you might not see, they're going to be able to bubble that up, but at the same time, you're going to need to make sure that you're booking them to stay happy, because if not, it can all unravel for you pretty quickly. The rest of the day mostly was smaller updates. Some interesting notes. They added the ability to determine elimination order in sort of multi-man elimination matches. Previously, the game just sort of decided it for you. I don't know if there's going to be a mechanical function of this, or if it's entirely cosmetic. I suspect that it's just going to be something that you could choose, but it'd be interesting if, someone doesn't, people get angry if they're the first out, if they're not, if they're a certain caliber wrestler, they don't want to be first out. Right now, the only sort of penalty you have to morale is if a person that's, wants to be booked strong loses, right? It's interesting. I want to see a little bit more of what's going on there. Day 3 is interesting. I think this is going to be really big and really powerful for people who do database work that really want a specific, realistic approximation of how wrestling promotions work. So what is the geotag system? So briefly, the geotags allow you to tag either a company, an event, or a location in order for database makers to subdivide game regions and create more realistic restricted areas where a company can go to. So, for example, we're still keeping within this game, in the US, your northeast, your southeast, your mid-south, etc. And, states, they're kind of part, that region is multiple states, and within those states is multiple, sub-regions. Well, it doesn't simulate that, right? It only simulates the general region. But the geotags allow each database maker to essentially make those sub-regions themselves. So the example they give is each venue can have up to 5 geotags that are up to 30 characters each. If used, they allow a venue to be situated within a specific subdivision of a region. So, for example, they gave us a couple different South England region tags, but, looking at one here, Lambeth Hall, they said London is one tag, South London is another tag, Lambeth is another tag. And companies' events work in exactly the same way. They can optionally have one geotag defined to each of the first 3 company sizes, so you can get a geotag for insignificant, for tiny, for small. If the tag is given, this means that at that size, the company should not be venturing outside of the regional subdivision. So for example, in that same example above, if you were a insignificant company, you might put the tag Lambeth in the insignificant category, South London in the tiny, and then all of London in the small. What the game's going to do is it's going to, for AI companies, so you don't have to deal with this. If you're a player, you can skip ahead. It doesn't matter at all to a player, other than the ultimate goal is to make these regions and these territories more concise and make companies more realistically be in certain locations. AI is going to only look for venues that fit that geotag or don't have a geotag. If it's an insignificant company, they're only going to run that little tiny area, and then as they get bigger, they're going to expand outward and outward. So this prevents, if you, for example, had a company that only ran Vegas, right? That's in the Southwest territory. So it would, in the game, be running California and Arizona, all different parts of Nevada, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This way, if you have a database maker and a mod maker who is putting in geotags appropriately, you could specify that until that company gets large enough, they are smack dab in a specific area or a specific region as they grow naturally. This is a really cool update. I don't think it's going to have a lot of major impact on players, but it should make the world more believable, which is always really important. And it also is a nice way to kind of subdivide those big, broad regions without completely ripping up the game and making like thousands of tiny little counties and stuff like that. Another interesting one that didn't really matter to me too much, but I know some people really wanted it. This one is actually probably going to make database making harder, which is real heights and weights. It says, by popular request, instead of a size category, workers will now use the real heights and weights. So heights range from 3 foot to 8 foot, and weight from 75 to 800 pounds. So everything that refers to those categories will now be switched to the new system to give a more realistic feel. You'll be able to control and adjust those, especially for a weight division. So if you wanted to have a light heavyweight belt, you now can specify specifically what weight that is. If you're using a converter to convert an older save that uses sort of those broad categories that existed before, it's going to just guess and provide probably some kind of like median calculation. You don't have to worry too much if you're a database maker, but if you're a person that really cares about those hyper-specific weights and heights, you have that option to put those in. Of course, we all know that anything you find on the internet's kayfabe anyway, so I don't know how much that really matters, but for some people it does, and that's fine. Again, some other small, minor little fixes and updates that I'm not going to go over. One thing I'll briefly go over, there's a little bit of controversy on day 3, and that's because for Cornellverse players, they announced that they're going to have 2 different roster picture packs that you can download. So they're going to have the regular one, which is still that blue background styled ones with the renders, but that's not the default one. But instead, they've been working to re-render using AI to give the world a much cleaner and fresher look. This has sparked some controversy online. Obviously, people have a varied opinions on the usage of AI in artwork, especially commercially. Personally, I suspect that this will not make it to the final game, just because people do have sort of that. So people have sort of a real hardline stance one way or the other, where either they don't care or they really care. And if they really care, that could be a problem for them. So maybe a bit of a misstep. I suspect this will be walked back and removed. If it doesn't, well, let me know. Does that change your desire to buy the game? Day 4 had something, there's another one that to me didn't matter at all, but apparently everybody else in the world really cared about this. And it is interesting, it is a big change, in a change that will be very well received, according to Adam. TEW IX will be switching to a real-world calendar. As mentioned elsewhere, the game has been in development for over 18 months. One of the big tasks that required so much time was ripping up the underlying architecture and changing everything to work with a different calendar. As you expect, this has a knock-on effect on pretty much every aspect of the game. So this is game-wide. He specifies from birthdays to scheduling events has all been changed to reflect this. It uses Windows' inbuilt calendar system. It can handle multiple formats, so however you write out the date, can do it. Essentially, imagine how Windows does it now. Clicking on it will launch a little pop-up calendar, so you can just click the date instead of having to always type it. So you have the ability to kind of quickly click through dates. So he goes into a little bit further detail with the new scheduling system here. For each event, there are now 5 settings that work in harmony to make up the scheduling system. The first is schedule. This is what you're familiar with from previous games, telling the game whether it's annual event, weekly, etc. Not much has changed there, but it did add one extra feature by request, which is actually pretty cool, which is bi-weekly. So now you can have an event running twice a month instead of just monthly or weekly or daily. Gives you a little bit more variety, a little bit more option. The second is positioning. So this can be set as a same exact date or a selection of ranges that include different combinations of things, like first Monday of the month, fourth Sunday of the month, last Friday of the month, You also actually can even put in a positioning shift, so you can say like first Monday of the month +3, so that you could always be on Black Friday for Thanksgiving or something like that. If you want lethal leap year, you can do it. Also, there's an option that you can select to avoid certain holidays. They do say that you can select from a list that includes American holidays and British holidays, etc. The etc's carrying a lot of weight there. I'm not sure what other holidays they've chosen. I hope that there's a list for like each region. It would be really nice. So if you're playing in, Japan, you could have specific holidays. If you're in Europe, there's specific holidays. They're not necessarily British holidays and American holidays. Not sure if that's what it's going to end up shaking out being. Overall, it's pretty much an interesting change, I think. Some people are going to really, really be all about it. To me personally, I just kind of got used to the way the game handled its calendar. It wasn't really that much of a big deal for me. And personally, the fact that they said that they were working on it for 18 months, if this was taking up a bunch of the time, I don't think it was time well spent. For me personally, I would have liked to seen that time reinvested in something that I felt was more mechanically significant to improving the game. I don't know if changing the calendar system to appease some people that just couldn't deal with the old system was necessarily the best approach. Another interesting update from today was that they're allowing the option to do multi-day events. So this is to simulate things like WrestleMania, Wrestle Kingdom that are now doing like 2-day events. You now have the ability to actually mark and target set in them and say with a tag, like, this is a 2-day event. They don't have to be in the same location. I don't think you even need to be in the same week, but you can kind of link them together to say, this is all part of one broader event. That's kind of interesting. It does come into play when calculating how many shows in a row a worker has been left off. All the shows in a series kind of a single event. So that's kind of the nice part of it. I almost wonder if that works for like a G1 situation where you want to have a G1 tournament, but you want to link them all together in some way. You kind of have the ability to do that. Obviously, WrestleMania Night 1, Night 2 comes to mind for this. Overall, a great little update to kind of simulate something that's been going on in the real world. Day 5. In here, again, not a huge amount of information, sort of the big guns. They were all fired off earlier in the week. We do get some updates that are pretty nice, which is awards. It's a much requested edition, according to Adam, and it says companies now have their own individual end-of-year awards that complement the familiar global version. These work exactly the same way as their global cousin. Additionally, these awards have been folded into the criteria for getting into a company-specific Hall of Fame. So, if you want to induct them, this is going to help get someone inducted. Previous year's company awards can also be added by the editor so they can add flavor to the past ones. I'm curious to see if you as a player have any control over this, or if only AI companies handle company awards out. Obviously, as a player, I think you can kind of just add someone to your Hall of Fame. But it'd be nice to see if there's like a reception to it, that like person being awarded it that didn't get enough accolades, maybe there's some blowback on it, Another big change here, this is one that was added from previous games well before I was starting to play, is touring contracts. So they return the game more intuitive with a robust design that takes advantage of the new calendar system. Workers will get signed in to lead up to tours, head over to the country in question when the tour begins, then stick around until the tour is over. The decision-making AI has also been overhauled so that the wrestlers are better at understanding the unique situation of being on tour. There's also some background AI that means workers won't be so promiscuous when it comes to working with anybody and everybody. They'll tend to be linked to a specific company, at least while they're actively being booked. This simulates a degree of loyalty, and also better for gameplay as it means more wrestlers get to go on tour rather than getting hogged by the same few people. Some other smaller ones that I wanted to kind of highlight was the global skill comparison. This is another one that I hope to get a little bit more information on. It's a new feature in the skill comparison screen that allows users to see the analysis of how the worker's skill levels compare to that of the rest of the world. For example, if you look at one wrestler's psychology in a database, you'll see a report that says of so many wrestlers who are eligible for comparison on their psychology. X number are considered better than this person, and X are considered equal. Therefore, this wrestler is within like the top blank percent. Kind of interesting feature that you're trying to build up a roster and trying to figure out who are the right people. You can quickly go and scan and see what position they're in, how many more workers are available that might be better than them. What we don't know is whether this only is within the game. This is a feature that I think is much more useful for mod making, for database design and editing, where people could quickly go in and balance to figure out, you know, if I have, Zack Sabre Jr. In, technical wrestling, he should be within the top 1%, but, I just imported all these people and now he's in the top 10% and it doesn't feel right. You might be able to go in and tweak the figures to make it more appropriate, more realistic. I hope that's in the database editor as well, because I think it'd be really finicky and kind of weird if it was available in the game to use, where I don't think it's as useful as it is for database editing. Another interesting one is cutting child companies loose. Users can now choose to cut loose any of their child companies. This means that they become independent. This is something quite a few players have asked for over the years, as it means you can get rid of a child company you no longer need, without actually having to kill it off and losing all of its history. So, if you're AEW and you're playing a realism save, you could toss Ring of Honor to the side and let them run free. Same thing if you're WWE, you could want to get rid of NXT, or if you're New Japan, you want to get rid of Stardom, etc., etc. Not sure if that's something you can request while playing a child company. Playable child companies is a relatively new thing to the series, and it was kind of undercooked in the previous edition, and I would really like to see more opportunities to make decisions as a child company, and maybe being able to sue for independence and pay yourself out to become an independent company is an interesting sort of milestone as it playing a child company that you could kind of endure. It would be really interesting. And overall, that is pretty much the big hitters for week 1 of the Developers Journal. We got a lot of big things, a little bit of controversy, some unanswered questions for this week. I'm really excited to see what next week has in store. Again, he's doing them one a day, so we'll have a whole host of new ones, and we're looking at close to, if not a little bit more than 200 different upgrades and improvements and notes that they have in store for us before the quickly arising public beta just in a couple weeks. So there's a lot to go through. I hope you guys liked this breakdown. Let me know what you think is the most interesting change so far this week. Let me know if there's anything you hate that you just heard about, and we can discuss it in the comments. Anyways, I will see you guys next week for week 2 of the Developer Journals. Thanks for watching.